Imagine a cluster of, say, 10 volcanic rocks.
Hmm.
They're just jutting out of the Atlantic about 500 kilometers off the coast of West Africa.
Right.
And for millions of years, the only residents are, well, wind, sea, birds. There's no indigenous population, just silence.
Which is already such a disruption to the usual narrative we cover here.
Yeah.
Usually when we apply our Thinking Africa lens to history,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about invasion. We're talking about,
Yeah.
existing civilizations being disrupted.
Exactly. But here in the 1460s, these rocks become the stage for, I can only describe it as this massive, brutal, and frankly fascinating social experiment.
It's a day zero scenario.
Yes.
We're talking about Cabo Verde.
Yeah.
And the source we're digging into today, this really detailed profile from South African History Online, updated just this year, April 2024, it makes a compelling case that Cabo Verde is unique. It wasn't conquered. It was synthesized.
Synthesized from the collision of Europe and Africa. So our mission today is to dig into this material, not just to recite dates, but to really understand the mechanics of how a nation gets built from scratch. We want to understand how geography, being a dry archipelago with basically no natural resources, forced a nation to invent a role for itself just to survive.
From a slave warehouse to a whaling hub, and then eventually to one of the most stable democracies on the continent. It's just a wild trajectory.
It is. And as we go through this, you and I need to keep asking, who holds the power here? Who pays the cost? And how did ordinary people navigate these huge global shifts?
So let's start at the beginning.
Or rather, the dispute about the beginning. The Portuguese arrive mid-1400s, but the source notes there's a bit of drama over who actually gets the credit for discovery.
Oh yeah, it's the classic explorer ego clash. You got figures like Diogo Gomes, Alves Catamosto, they're both claiming they saw it first.
But who gets the official credit?
Well, historically, King Alfonso V of Portugal gave the official nod to an Italian sailor, Antonio de Noli, and they established the first settlement, Ribeira Grande, in 1462.
Okay, 1462. I just want to pause on that date because context is everything. That is 30 years before Columbus set sail for the Americas.
Which makes Cabo Verde the prototype. This was the beta test for European colonialism in the tropics. It was the laboratory.
A lab.
But, and this is a nuance that really jumped out at me from the source, for the first few centuries, Portugal didn't strictly see this as a colony in the way we might think of, say, Angola later on.
The source uses a very specific phrase, an extension of Portugal.
That phrasing is so heavy. Legally, socially, the Portuguese crown treated these islands like a detached piece of the homeland.
I found that fascinating because of what it implies about the power dynamics. If you view the territory as home, you govern it differently, don't you?
You do. It meant that initially you didn't have that immediate, violent antagonism between the authorities and the residents that defined so much of colonial history.
But it wasn't a paradise.
Oh, not at all. Don't get me wrong, we're about to get to the slavery part. But the political relationship was distinct. The Portuguese settlers and the African population were living in a much tighter, more integrated proximity.
Okay, but let's talk about the economics, because geography eventually hits them with a reality check. The source says the Portuguese arrived thinking they could just replicate the plantation model.
They wanted sugar. They wanted cotton. This was the economic model of the time. Find land, plant cash crops, get rich.
But Cabo Verde is volcanic. It's incredibly dry.
The land just rejected it. The plantation model collapsed almost immediately.
So now you have a colony that can't grow anything. In the 1500s, if your colony doesn't grow sugar, it's basically useless.
Yeah.
Unless you find a different commodity.
And that commodity became human beings.
Hmm.
Because the agriculture failed, the Portuguese had to pivot. They looked at the map. Cabo Verde sits perfectly between Guinea-Bissau on the mainland and Brazil in South America.
Logistics.
Exactly. It became a warehouse, a supply port. The islands became the central hub for the transatlantic slave trade.
And the source details the lived reality of this, and it's chilling. It wasn't just a quick stopover.
No, not at all. Enslaved people were brought from the mainland, and many were kept there for a specific purpose. The source calls it being culturally and materially prepared.
That's a clinical euphemism for a brutal process.
For seasoning, enslaved Africans were held on the islands to be broken in, taught basic Portuguese, stripped of their original identities before being shipped across the ocean to Brazil.
Which creates this massive demographic shift. The population of the islands becomes this mix of Portuguese settlers running the logistics and Africans from all over the mainland who are either enslaved or working in this ecosystem.
And this fusion is where the identity of Cabo Verde really begins. But we have to fast forward to the moment where this whole economic house of cards collapses.
1807. The British passed the Abolition of Slave Act.
And this is where the vulnerability of Cabo Verde's economy gets exposed. The entire system was built on trafficking human beings. When the British Empire, which controlled the seas, makes it illegal, the demand plummets
And the economy collapses.
overnight.
So what was the reaction from the mother country, this nation that claimed the islands were an extension of Portugal?
Well, they basically ghosted them.
Wow.
It just exposes the lie of benevolent colonialism, doesn't it? You're only family as long as you're profitable.
Yeah.
The source says once the revenue dried up, Portugal stopped sending supplies.
And the text explicitly mentions starvation became commonplace. You have a population trapped on rocks that can't support them, and the ships just start coming.
And that desperation that creates the next phase of their identity. This is where the American connection comes in.
The whalers from New England.
Right. Throughout the 19th century, American ships are hunting whales for oil, and they need a place to restock, repair, pick up crew. And Cabo Verde is right there.
And for a young Cape Verdean man watching his family starve, that American ship must have looked like a lifeboat.
A very hard, dangerous lifeboat. Whaling was incredibly difficult work, but it was a ticket out. This is the origin story of the huge Cape Verdean diaspora in the U.S., particularly in places like Massachusetts. It wasn't migration for adventure, it was evacuation for survival.
So you have this population leaving, but for those who stayed, a new culture was hardening. We need to talk about creolization. The source makes a big deal about this.
This is fundamental, because you had European settlers and African enslaved people living in such a small, confined space for centuries. The cultures didn't just exist side by side.
They fused.
They fused. And the most powerful symbol of that fusion is the language. Crioulo.
Portuguese was the official language, the language of the state.
Right, of the administration, the police.
Hmm.
But Crioulo was the language of the people. It emerged as a blend of Portuguese vocabulary and African grammar and syntax.
And the source argues that Crioulo eventually became more than just a way to talk. It became a political weapon.
It became a tool of resistance. Later in the 20th century, Crioulo was the unifying thread. It connected the struggle in Cabo Verde with the struggle in Guinea-Bissau. It was a kind of secret code the colonizers couldn't fully control.
Speaking of organizing, let's move into the Liberation era. Mid-20th century, Portugal's under a dictatorship. And in 1956, a movement is born, the PAIGC.
The African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. And you have to note the name. It's one party for two countries.
And the central figure here is Amilcar Cabral. I mean, if you're studying African political theory, he is an absolute giant.
A brilliant strategist. He was born to Cape Verdean parents but lived in Guinea-Bissau. And he argued for unity. He believed that if Cabo Verde tried to fight alone, they would just be crushed. They needed the strategic depth of the mainland.
But this is where the geography complicates things again. The source points out a tactical reality. You can't fight a guerrilla war on Cabo Verde.
I mean, think about it. Guerrilla warfare relies on cover. You need forests, mountains, jungles.
Places to hide.
Exactly. Cabo Verde is a small archipelago of dry, open islands. There's literally nowhere to hide. If you start a shooting war there, the Portuguese Navy just surrounds you and starves you out.
So the war happened in Guinea-Bissau on the mainland.
Exactly. But, and this is where our Thinking Africa lens helps us spot the nuance, the leadership was heavily Cape Verdean.
Why was that?
It goes back to that extension of Portugal status. Because the Portuguese viewed the islanders as slightly more civilized than mainland Africans, they gave them better access to education.
So they used Cape Verdeans as colonial administrators.
Yes, the civil servants of the empire. They created a middle management class.
It's backfired on them.
Spectacularly.
Yeah.
The empire trained the very people who would lead the revolution against it. You had educated Cape Verdeans who were sent to work in Guinea-Bissau, saw the exploitation, and connected the dots. They used the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
So when the fighting started in the jungles, many of the commanders and strategists were Cape Verdean. But tragically, Amilcar Cabral never got to see independence.
No. He was assassinated in 1973. It was a plot engineered by the Portuguese Secret Services, a huge loss for the continent, and it really foreshadowed the tensions to come.
However, history marched on. April 1974, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. The dictatorship falls. And suddenly, the door to independence just swings open.
And in 1975, Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau both declare independence.
Yeah.
Aristides Maria Pereira becomes the first president of Cabo Verde.
Now, this is where a lot of summaries just stop. They got independence, the end. But the source digs into the post-independence messiness, The plan was still to unite the two countries, right?
That was the dream, Pan-African unity.
Yeah.
But political reality is, well, it's often much messier than theory.
What broke the dream?
Deep cultural resentment. The mainlanders in Guinea-Bissau felt that the Cape Verdeans, who, remember, had been the colonial administrators, the educated elite, were dominating the party and the government. They felt like they had just traded white Portuguese masters for light-skinned Cape Verdean masters.
That is a harsh reality. The colonial hierarchy left a scar that disrupted the liberation itself.
And it all boiled over in 1980. There was a military coup in Guinea-Bissau, the government was overthrown, and the coup leaders were explicitly anti-Cape Verdean. That coup killed the dream of a unified state.
So Cabo Verde is suddenly on its own, 1980. The dream of unity is dead. And looking at the internal politics of the islands, things took a pretty dark turn. The source mentions a Trotskyite crisis.
This is a crucial moment. The ruling party, the PAICV, was facing internal dissent. There was a wing of radical socialists who wanted to push for aggressive, rapid land reform. They wanted a hard left revolution.
And the government's response wasn't exactly democratic.
No, the mainstream leadership purged the radicals. They claimed these reforms would destabilize the fragile economy, and after that they clamped down and declared a formal one-party state. So for the 1980s, Cabo Verde was essentially a mild dictatorship.
Which brings us to the miracle of 1991. Most one-party states in Africa during the Cold War didn't give up power easily.
But Cabo Verde read the room. By the early 90s, the Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The PAICV leadership realized that their survival strategy of Cold War neutrality was expiring. They knew that to attract Western donors and investment in a post-Soviet world, they had to look like a democracy.
So it was a pragmatic pivot.
Heavily pragmatic. They opened up the political floor.
Yeah.
They held multi-party elections in 1991, and the most shocking thing happened.
What?
The liberation heroes, the PAICV, they lost.
That is the true test of a democracy, isn't it? When the people with the guns and the historical legitimacy actually step down when they lose an election.
Exactly. The PAICV lost to the Movement for Democracy, the MPD, and the transition was peaceful. The old guard just packed up their desks and went into opposition. This is why the source calls Cabo Verde an African exception regarding stability.
It's just a remarkable trajectory, from slave depot to one-party state to a functioning, almost boringly stable democracy.
And in the world of political science, boring is the highest compliment you can pay a government. It just means the system works.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to switch into educator mode. We've covered a lot of ground. As an analyst, what are the key takeaways you want our listener to hold on to?
I think there's three main pillars here. First is context. You have to remember this is a nation born from the intersection of uninhabited land and the slave trade. There's no pre-colonial golden age to look back to.
The identity is forged in the colonial fire.
Entirely. Second is power and vulnerability. The lack of natural resources forced the islands to rely on human capital. First, it was selling people, then exporting labor, then exporting stability to get aid. They've always had to hustle.
And the third?
Agency. It is easy to see small island nations as just victims of history. But Cape Verdeans used their position within the empire, their education, their language, to facilitate liberation not just for themselves, but for Guinea-Bissau too. They punched way above their weight class.
I also want to quickly mention the name change. In 2013, they formally requested the UN to use Cabo Verde in all languages.
And that's about cultural dignity. It's an assertion that we define who we are. We're not the English Kate Green. We are Cabo Verde. It's a rejection of being translated for the convenience of others.
Okay, for you, the listener, we have some critical thinking questions to leave you with.
First, consider the geography. How did being islands dictate the method of their liberation? They couldn't fight a war at home. How does that shape a national psyche, knowing your freedom was won on someone else's soil?
That's a good one. Here's another. How does that extension of Portugal mentality differ from the pure extraction colonialism we see elsewhere? If your colonizer tells you you are actually Portuguese, how does that mess with your head when you're fighting for independence?
And finally, a question on stability.
Yeah.
Cabo Verde is democratic, but it is heavily dependent on foreign aid and remittances. Is a democracy truly secure if its economy is dependent on the generosity of outsiders?
Heavy questions, but necessary ones.
Indeed.
As we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought from the source material. The text mentions that there are oral histories, stories of Arab and African fishermen visiting the islands long before the Portuguese.
Right.
But the history books, the written records, they call this mythological and credit the Europeans with discovery.
Which just raises the question, how much of African history is dismissed as myth simply because it wasn't written down in a ship's log by a European captain? Who gets to decide what uninhabited really means?
Something to mull over. Cabo Verde is more than just a holiday destination. It's a complex case study in survival, adaptation, and forging a new identity against all odds.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Stay curious.